nor are they multiple, but they're a network. And this network takes in every sector of the economy, and it takes in every dimension of human life. So when we look at sustainability studies in relationship to ecology, our eventual goal is not only the flourishing of nature, it is also the flourishing of human communities. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, because we're human, and if we don't flourish, nature won't flourish, because we are in the Anthropocene era. There's no way for us not to make an impact on the society as well as the natural world. So the second reason is that non-flourishing societies don't care about environmental concerns. You know, if you are in a war-torn area, you're not worrying about climate change. So sustainability studies looks at the intersection of all of the sectors of the economy, so it's multi-sectoral, all of the facets of human existence, whether it's art, religion, spirituality, aesthetics, all of this is multifaceted. So it's multi-sectoral, multifaceted in terms of human dimensions. And also, it is interrelated. So that the relationship between industries, between the medical industry, between the hospitality industry, between agriculture, and between people's religious lives, ethical lives, moral lives, aesthetic orientations, matter. Yet they're not obvious. They're not obvious. When you think environment, you think, well, I should recycle, I should cut back on my use of my car, I should vote for politicians who will save landscapes. Of course we should do all that. But the reason that we're in this state is because of a very unaware and unconscious response to our lives as individuals and our lives as societies, integrated societies. So sustainability studies looks at, as Vice President Kim has said, ecology, economics, and also equity. So we are seeking, through sustainability studies, to find that sweet point where human flourishing and the restoration of the natural world can occur in tandem. So it's something that has already started. In our IMAS, the MAS part, that is Masters of Arts in Sustainability Studies, exists in very few places, but it exists. But there's no religious component to it, and of course, no interreligious component to it. So we seek to bring into conversation with this field the insights, resources, principles, ethics, and moral experience of the world's great religious traditions in collaboration. Thank you.
Greetings of peace, everyone. Welcome to the GTU. I'm Munir Jiwa, I direct the Center for Islamic Studies I also want to thank Mira and Ajay Shingle, Center for Dharma Studies, for leading this effort, and Dr. Rita Sharma for really convening all of us and thinking more about the particular way in which sustainability studies might unfold here through IMAS. I love the title. And ways in which we at the GQ have been thinking about not what it is just to be religious, but to be interreligious, right? So this idea that we are moving from what has historically been Christian ecumenical place to a more larger kind of understanding of various religions together. But it's not just multi-religious, having each religion represented, which is important. But our kind of next phase, which is really now that we are more religiously representative and increasingly so, how do we actually work together? What does it mean to actually move from being multi-religious to interreligious? So I think sustainability studies provides a really important way in which we think about our interreligiosity and our being in the world. A few years ago, we had a conference here on ecology and the environment, and we called it Earthlings. And our dear colleague, Dr. Nomi Seidman, who was then the director of the Center for Jewish Studies, Dr. Dina Aronoff is the director now. We called it Earthlings, and it was a really interesting title, I thought. Partly because it had us reimagine what it means to think of ourselves as Earthlings. We often think of ourselves through various categories: I'm Muslim, you're Hindu, or Christian, Jewish, Mormon, all of these categories, male, female, so gendered categories, sexual minority categories, whatever categories, nationality, language. But to think of ourselves as Earthlings provided a really new platform in which to think about ourselves in a different way, in which to think about ourselves as inhabiting this planet in a larger universe of planets, and to think of ourselves in a different relationship. So a lot of the work in sustainability, as I see it, is about relationships, how we relate to one another. And Dr. Rita already mentioned the idea of these networks, and this kind of integrated or holistic approach to how we think about sustainability, I think is just right. It's not just the economic sector, or just the health sector, or social sector, or cultural sector, but also the aesthetic sector, right? It's all of these things together. So this approach we take, I think, to sustainability has to be an integrated one in which we live our lives, right? And we all work in very, very different sectors. But it's also made me think about what this means to do this kind of work in a context of what is largely increasingly being taken up as a clash of civilizations, war, poverty, devastation around the world, displacement, refugees. What does it mean to think about this work in this context? What does it mean to take responsibility for our participation in this displacement? So not just our responsibility to fix or try to attend to some of the problems of the world, but how we actually participate in these wars, in the displacement of others. So often we kind of look at how can we help refugees, but we also need to be thinking about more deeper questions about what are the conditions we have been responsible in creating in which refugees find themselves, right? So I think there's a double part to our work here, at least two parts, many more, of not just the moral mandate we find in our own traditions that we can bring to a larger public, so the particular values we hold, which allow themselves to flourish in a more universal way in the public, but also to ask both the questions of how are we responsible for that devastation, and then what are our responsibilities in reconstructing. So it's a constructive project as well. My own work in the arts has pushed me to think about what I'll talk about a little bit more this afternoon on eco-aesthetic engagements. And I'll be looking at the work of the Aga Khan Development Network, and particularly the Aga Khan Trust for Culture in its work across the world, whether it's building schools and hospitals, but also what I'll focus on in terms of building parks. In my own tradition, the Islamic tradition, in the world that we're in today is marred by what I've been calling the 5 media pillars of Islam. So the framing of Islam is a very negative one. It's around 9/11, around violence, around Muslim women, conversations around veiling, around ideas of Islam and the West rather than Islam in the West, and a focus on the Middle East. These are largely what I've been calling the 5 frames. And I would like to offer that there's also an aesthetic frame in which we can reimagine much of what the Muslim world looks like, which has been forgotten, right? So this idea of gardens, this idea of parks, and I'll share examples this afternoon. And part of that sensibility of belonging to the world is also, as Rumi says, let the beauty, let what you do be the beauty that you love, and let that shine through what we do, right? And so this sense that parks and gardens help us reimagine, for example, the Islamic tradition, feels like a very removed way in which we think about Islam and Muslims today, right? So if I bring up parks and gardens as the way, or art and architecture as the way of thinking about Islam today, it feels way beyond imagination. And yet, I would argue, as I will show this afternoon, because it's very central to the way in which Muslims think about their lives. So I won't take up much more time, except to say that I think each one of us can find in our traditions, or whatever backgrounds we come from, a certain kind of mandate, an ethical and moral mandate to recognize our connectedness, to recognize our vulnerabilities, the precariousness of life, and what commitments we have to each other. In the Islamic tradition, this idea of being a khalifa, of being a steward on earth, is an entrustment that we receive from God, as we believe. And part of that means we care for not only our fellow beings as a way, and not just our fellow beings, but the entire environment, the planet, the flowers, the plants, the animals. These are all various relationships we have. And part of those relationships, at least as I interpret it in the Islamic tradition, is also a way of knowing God, the way in which we treat our fellow human beings. So the Quranic verse 49:13 from the Quran says, "We have made you nations and tribes so that you may know one another." Right? So this idea of knowing one another is a reciprocal one. Even the Arabic verb is about reciprocity, the ta'arufu, to know one another. So we have this moral mandate. And for Muslims, again, this idea of masjid, many of you have heard the word for mosque, but the word masjid is much wider than that. The word masjid's root is from the word sajda, which is a place of prostration. In the Islamic tradition, the entire world is a place of prostration. And so if that's the mandate we have, then you treat the entire earth as sacred. And if you treat the entire world as sacred, then everyone and everything in it is sacred. So I'll leave you with those opening remarks and then look forward to our conversations throughout the conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. It's such an honor to be a part of this, and I would like to thank you, Rita, as well, for bringing us together and introducing a really important kind of paradigm shift almost in how we think about our interreligious work, and I'm very grateful that you are with us in the Center for Dharma Studies as a part of the GTU. I'm Dina Aronoff, and I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies here, and this bringing of religion into this project of sustainability studies, I think, is very important, as Rita and others have said. The interconnectedness of human activity and the natural world and our various communities, which can overwhelm any attempt to try to address the challenges to sustainability. I think that necessitates the participation of religion in this project, because religion continues to be one of the conceptual frameworks that organize mass human behavior. And so it's still this potent framework to move through the world en masse, for better and for worse. And what that means is that if we can contribute to new religious thinking that integrates the very challenging paradigm shift that sustainability requires, then we might be able to have impact. So I'm here to speak to the place of Judaism in this to some extent, and I'll again speak about this a bit later at the 1 o'clock plenary, but I do want to just note maybe a little bit of a kind of more kind of grim chapter in these developments, which is I know that when environmentalism first picked up in the 1970s, actually the Bible was identified as a kind of bad guy in the story, and in particular the early verses of Genesis in the creation, which has this kind of anthrocentric narrative. Humanity is the pinnacle of creation, who can then draw from the natural world and its bounty. A lot of work has been done to establish that there's a lot of ambiguity in that text. Furthermore, there's a mandate, to use Munir's language, throughout the biblical text of a high, kind of acute level of duty that the human being has towards the environment, and that is true. But I don't want to lose the fact that, indeed, I think it is the case that the Hebrew biblical imagination is one in which the sacred cycles of the natural world were kind of overlaid and to some extent replaced with a sacred history. I know that I'm using Mircea Eliade's work, and that's quite an old-fashioned reference, but nevertheless the idea that sacredness moved from those things that repeat themselves with awesome grandeur in the natural world to actually things that will never happen again. The Exodus from Egypt, or as it's carried forward into the Christian narrative, the life and death of Jesus and resurrection. These one-time events that become paradigmatic, we can return to them, but sacredness is now happening over time in history and involving particular people. It's a move away from regarding as sacred actually those things that return upon themselves over and again in the natural world. And again, there's beautiful work to integrate those two, but I don't want to lose the impact of that early paradigm shift, which has this kind of anthrocentric quality to it. Pair that with the theological shift in which the multiple deities that govern the varieties of experience and the varieties in the natural world, the masculine and feminine, what were regarded as masculine and feminine attributes, not only of human beings, but of the natural world, that found correspondence in a very rich kind of network of gods and goddesses, that also kind of recedes in the Hebrew biblical imagination, in which a single, far more abstract, though still somewhat anthropomorphic anthropomorphic God, now governs in relation to humankind, and the natural world in a way responds to divine will. And what that means is, I will tell you on the one hand, there's a strong ethical mandate that results from this, because now human action, which includes human kindness and duty to others, but that's the factor in whether the rains will come, and whether the grain will sprout, and whether the natural world is now an expression of the ethics of human behavior. Now, I will tell you that ethical paradigm is useful in sustainability studies, because actually you could argue now in this day and age it is so that the natural world, the state of the natural world is so linked to our lifestyles and behaviors. It is true. At the same time, the fact that the God language of the Hebrew Bible, again, has that kind of singular quality, and that the human relationship to the God is a central relationship, the natural world to some extent is an instrument of divine expression, I think also could have resulted, or is symptomatic of a worldview in which attunement to the natural world might have gone dim. And I really would love to talk more about this, and I'm looking around at GTU, especially GTU faculty who I know have expertise in this, and to recover, of course, the productive role that the same theological imagination can play. Especially, and I'll just conclude with this, that I will say that there is a very strong articulation of duty that is part of this system, and which can be the basis of sustainable living. At the same time, I wonder whether, nevertheless, what the challenge of sustainability will pose to religious systems, such as Judaism, is a, again to use that word paradigm shift, in which the operations of the natural world attain a kind of ontological status, no longer, again, simply as a function of human obedience or disobedience to the instruction of God, but has a kind of sacred function in and of itself. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here today, especially to Rita for inviting me to make a few brief remarks at the beginning of this incredible event. And thank you for the wisdom of this panel. I've heard much of what I was going to say has been said beautifully. So I'm going to take a different tactic and speak for a minute of a wider frame. The frame that goes from this planet with its ecology, which is a kind of snapshot of a long 4 billion year history of evolution, which is a part of a 13.8 billion year history of this universe. And that really is, if you like, the frame, Pache multiverse speculators. And it's really the frame in which we live and move and have our being. So I just want to remind you of how far we've come since the 60s when I was a kid in the physics department at Stanford. Sorry, Carl. And learning about what seemed to be a purely physical universe, a kind of given, laws of physics for what they were, the values of the natural constants, like the speed of light was what it was. You memorized it, but it had no meaning. And the humanities world. And I had a major in religion and in music as well as physics, so I tried to span those fields. It was a challenge. But the real challenge was they couldn't be spanned intellectually, because the physical world, this rock we float on, had nothing to do with biology and chemistry and love and passion and war and peace. They were just different worlds. Well, we learned a very different picture of the cosmos since then. The cosmos is not a timeless artifact that has no relation to people like us with history. Right? We're born, we live our life, we die. In fact, the cosmos is now seen as a historical phenomenon. The cosmos has a unique history. As Dina said about the Exodus and the life of Christ, the revelation of Muhammad, and so on, the universe itself has a unique history. We'll never be in a time again when the first generation stars were out there. Without all the heavy metals we have today. My wedding ring is made from the death of that first generation stars, and they're supernovas, which produce all the heavy elements. And then in second and third generation stars, planets made of those that on the Earth were on, right? And the conditions for life. Only starting in the 80s did we begin to realize that those strange constants of nature that we memorize, like the speed of light and Planck's constant, are actually clues for why this universe is capable of life. You've all heard of that argument, the fine-tuning argument, and the anthropic principle. Basically, it says that if the universe wouldn't have been the way it is, if the laws of nature, laws of physics, and the natural constants didn't have their exact form, life couldn't have arisen by natural means, by evolution. Doesn't mean it had to, or how it had to, because it's still a historical phenomenon. But it couldn't have. So in fact, as John Barrow will say with a wink, biology puts conditions on physics. Silly, because of course physics puts conditions on biology. But in a certain way, the fact that we're here says something really unique about the universe we're in. And it tells us in some ways, to quote Stuart Kaufman's wonderful phrase, we are at home in the universe. When I was a kid, I thought I was sort of homeless in the universe. It didn't seem to matter that we were here. Human life didn't seem to have any ultimate meaning except those captured in the religions. But science seemed to undercut that. Now we can say there is a deep compatibility between the scientific view of the universe from mathematics and physics and cosmology, all the way through the neurosciences, to that phenomena we all share so passionately in here at the GPU, which is religion, spirituality, world religions, comparative theology, comparative spiritualities, philosophy, religion. That incredible world we live in, we devote our time and energy to, in this panel so beautifully represents, really is at home in the universe, and in some way, not anthropocentric, but in some way, a clue to what the universe is about. Right? That connection is so deep, is so tied to who we are, that in a certain sense, our lives and visions and passions and conceits and destructive power is in some ways what the universe is about. And now, with the discovery of what, 2,000 exoplanets, right? A few being just a few light years away. Beam me up, Scotty. You know, now we are on the brink of discovering whether or not we're alone in the universe or at home in an even deeper way. If there are other forms of, not just microbial life, because we have them here on Mars, probably, and Jupiter, but intelligent life. There could, in fact, be intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. There's a huge debate in science about it. But if it's true that there are many worlds, as Carl Sagan used to say, then the question will be, what can we learn about humanity through the discovery of ET that we can only learn about humanity through that discovery? Are we life gone wrong, and in some ways demonic, and climate change seems to suggest we are, or are we some ways, as Dina said, some clue to the purpose of life on Earth through the Imago Dei, which we treasure? And if that is that shared with other life forms in the universe? So we are at an amazing point now where not only is the universe a historical phenomenon, not just a physics phenomenon or internal one, but a historical one, never repeat its time, but we're in some ways about to discover if we really are at home in a community of life in the universe. All of that is of tremendous significance to religion. If, as Tillich said, religion is the shape of culture and culture the content of religion, then that culture of not just our planet, but the spectrum of planetary life in the universe would be an amazing discovery for religion, an amazing source of new vision for our sense of the human quest and the human spirit, and the spirit of nature. So what we don't want to forget, the crisis we're in, particularly now with the current administration, the crisis we're in over the environment. And I'm so grateful for this program of sustainability that will link our addressing the crisis with our addressing all of those dimensions of the crisis that the panel has so beautifully spoken about. But now we're also at a point where we can bring in the natural sciences to give us a frame for all of that to be interpreted, and a sense of the meaning of this venture of life on Earth. Our personal lives, our life as a species, life of all the species, and its relation, or possible relation, to other intelligent life, moral, capable of moral behavior and moral judgment in the universe. So I think we stand at a fantastic point in time. The G2 is an incredible place to be standing in that point in time. And I want to celebrate the new coming together of the natural sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, particularly religion. Thank you very much, and God bless.
Okay, we have 2 days to discuss all of this, and so we're not going to try to unpack everything in the next, we've got 8 minutes before the next panel. So, but what we are going to do is give you an opportunity, if you have a specific question for one of the panelists. And I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to limit it to that, because probably we all have questions we'd like to hear all 5 of them address, but there'll only be one of those such questions, and they'd each get 30 seconds each. So instead, I think if you have something to follow up specifically with one of these panelists, for something that they said, to invite your questions to them, and I'll just ask them to address them from where they are. And then the broader questions will certainly be continuing to discuss for the next couple of days. So, with that in mind, are there some questions that are specific and brief? Thank you.
So this is hopefully brief, just for Dr. Jiwa. If you could kindly repeat your 5 pillars, media pillars of Islam, and just maybe say a sentence about each one. I tried to note them down, and there's a haziness with a couple of them.
We can do this.
Sorry, this is the 8th year, and it's embarrassing to say the paper is in different places, but I keep repeating this, so I'm glad it can actually be useful. So the first one is the temporal category of 9/11 as a frame in which we understand Islam and Muslims. So that's the first one. The second one is the frame of violence, fundamentalism, terrorism. You know, I argue that words like jihad, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, madrasa, these are all English words now. So how Arabic actually and other languages enters the English language in this kind of negative way. So that's a second frame. The third is the frame around Muslim women and questions around veiling and whether Islam is an oppressive religion or not. So this is the third frame. The fourth is the idea of Islam and the West, so at odds, and rather than thinking about Islam in the West, so the long history of, for example, Muslims being enslaved in the Americas, being here right from the start, or Muslims in Europe as part of the West, not just Islam and the West. And the last frame is the Middle East as the kind of spatial or geographic zone through which we always think about Islam and Muslims, remembering that Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country, South Asia is the largest region. So those are the 5 frames, and they're online as well. So.
Thank you. Any questions at the back? Yes.
I think this is for either Dr. Kim or Dr. Sharma. I'm wondering where you see indigenous wisdom and traditions fitting in.
Who wants to take that one?
I think that the problem is one of epistemic arrogance. We need epistemic equity and epistemic humility. So when we respect the epistemic framework of somebody working in a certain field, we take their word as gospel truth. So an astrophysicist tells us the status of the cosmos. We have absolutely no way of verifying that. At least I certainly don't. Bob probably does. But we take that as gospel truth. We take that at face value. Why? Because we trust the structure in which she or he was educated. We trust their methodology of inquiry. We trust their equipment with which they do that inquiry. And so we trust the result. When you have, not just from indigenous traditions, but coming out of a Dharma tradition, Hinduism, when we have insights coming out of the Hindu or Buddhist world, or shamanic worlds, indigenous religious worlds, and even when we find that they're efficacious, they actually work, we are still very skeptical and tend to look at it as sort of a placebo effect, metaphorically. The reason is we do not trust their epistemology. And why do we not research their epistemology? Why do we not inquire into their epistemology? Because we have epistemological arrogance. And if we are to come together to solve a problem humanity's never faced the likes of, we can only do it with epistemic humility. So thank you for bringing up that.
Yes.
Yes, I wanted someone on the panel. Are we moving from the idea of one God, which is the basis of the Bible, controlling everything, to more of what Raimundo Panikar says is maybe closer to what we're living in, is the theandric paradigm. Could someone comment on that?
Hopefully. You want to take that?
Can you define the cosmotheandric paradigm?
Well, what he has written about, I'm sure other people are more qualified than me, is to look at our worldview and our spiritual view as more of an interaction between cosmic forces, God, or deity or divine, and andro, the human. So you're not looking at just one entity having control of everything. I seem to hear people saying that now the cosmos now is no longer just some physical entity. It has something more to do with what humans are experiencing and reacting. So I just wanted to know, like, what
I
is
think
your
maybe we could
thinking?
just take this as a very helpful comment
Yes.
that will stimulate discussion for the rest of the, you framed it as the question, are we moving? And I think the answer is, some people have suggested that's a positive way forward. I mean, Hanukkah is a great example.
Yes.
So, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just curious. We have a number of communities that are already not sustainable. They're very close by. They're the refinery towns in Contra Costa County. They are West Oakland with the port. Yet I see no one of, no African American, no Latina people on this panel, nor do I see them well represented in the room, though obviously there are a few of them. And I'm just wondering to what extent you reached out to the environmental justice communities and environmental justice issues in putting together this material.
Well, to answer your first comment, wait for the next panel.
Okay, good.
To answer your second comment, we've just begun an initiative and we're already reaching out to quite a few such groups.
Great, thank you.
And that does remind us, the next panel is in just a minute. So I saw one hand at the back, so if you have a quick question? Yeah.
So this is questions to Dr. Dina. So right now, the political influence and the religious, for example, operating in Russia, they have kind of a stamp. Yeah. Okay. So in Russia, if they have like the Jehovah Faith, which has been banned because of political reason, and there are like more than 10 million people who got affected. They are really doing a lot of ecological sustainable initiatives to make a balance in Russia itself. So how an intellectual body from like UC Berkeley or many other groups influence to make a synthesis between those political influences and the religious stability? So that is the, which can bring some value to the society.
Is that directed to me?
You were invited to.
Yes. So you're asking about the mobilization of religious frameworks for
Here are
correcting?
very many countries have been like, jeopardized by the influences of different operative level.
Many communities are, it's a little louder, sorry.
Yeah, right. Just like I gave an example in the Russia, which has
Yes.
happened recently, and earlier also it has happened many times to different minority group have been, asked like to stop their activities. So
Yes. Well, I think your topic, as many of the comments, raise many questions, and there's a lot of observations wrapped into the questions that I'd love to talk more about. But the one thing I'll just pick up on is to say that the force of religion right now, its capacity to mobilize people, often takes place with a kind of particularist style. Creating in-groups and out-groups, which provides some sense of identity and security that motivates people and gives them some kind of sense of orientation in a kind of bewildering age. And I do think that it's possible that the first phase of using religion, as it were, to respond to the demand for immediate reconsideration of our lifestyles might be using religion in its particular forms. And I was just alluding to the possibility that we might be nearing an age, please God, I think, when some of those kind of almost like the ways that religion distinguishes us one from the other and creates the beauty of our diversity. In a way, I'm sad to let it go. In the verse that Munir shared, in which the Quran describes the beautiful multiplicities of who we are. Part of me hopes that we'll sustain that even in a new paradigm, but I think it's the case, however, that some kind of earthling paradigm in which we are located in this vast cosmos and cosmic history, and which our differences that define us, we don't have the luxury of those differences any longer. And can we rise to the occasion, even psychologically speaking, to consider ourselves as part of this network of life is the question. And the examples that you're providing indicate that we still, our human history and political history seems to still be moved by a more narrow sense of self. I hope that even within that paradigm we'll be able to make positive change.
Thank you. We're going to need to stop to move on to the next panel. Please join me in thanking these. We've gotten us off to a great start. Just a quick practical sustainability announcement. Restrooms are out that door and the far corner of the building over there. There are some seats still up front, those who are standing at the back. As this panel moves out, the next panel comes in, I'll turn things over to Christopher Ocker, who will be chairing the next Good move, because that was what you had to say is
Hello there.
Of all people. And their conviction, as Dr. King said in his commencement address at Oberlin College and numerous other places, that not just that we are interdependent, but that there is no possibility of joy or hope or success without recognizing the necessity of the success, the joy, the well-being of the other. And that my well-being is dependent on your well-being, and your well-being is dependent on mine. It is a fundamentally ecological way of thinking, and it is one that this conference is encouraging us to consider in its broadest dimensions, as you just heard in the previous panel. It is actually a fundamental quality of any sound historical research as well. Without taking any more of your time, that is why I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Aaron Gazelle will be talking about pre-epistemological loci in the ontological and practical modalities of Dr. King's beloved community. Valerie Miles Tribble will be talking about baby subs and the clearing rock of ages. Jennifer Davidson we'll be talking about a theological commitment to the solidarity of others. And Felipe Maya will be talking about a change from your program. For Your Accent Betrays You, Notes on a Racist World Sound. Without further ado, Aaron, please welcome them to this.
Thank you so much, Chris Ocker, and would like to thank Ms. Sherma and the entire staff and those who worked and put this together for this honorable invitation to speak with you today about an area that is close personally in more ways than one, and sort of touches on a few areas that are of interest to me scholastically and academically, and this occasion allowed me to sort of explore that a bit deeper. So thank you so much. Just as a housekeeping note, I am a 7th generation son of preachers in the African-American tradition. Southern African-American. Which means that I have 4 closings. So when you hear the first one, just know that there are 3. That all needs to be done in 14 minutes. So we will try to move forward as we go. Thank you so much. I'd like to explore 3 points, I believe, in Dr. King's thought that served as sort of his centering principles with respect to his social activism and social justice, and how those 3 points, I believe, can serve as loci for our present day social justice movements and how we sort of see ourselves in our varied generations moving forward in creating what King, following Josiah Royce's thought on beloved community, could be. These 3 points touch 1 on personalism, nonviolence, and justice as the 3 points I want to explore with you that serve concatenated, working together as centering agent for Dr. King's movement. We want to start with personalism. As many of us know, Dr. King was a student at Boston University, and he was a student of the Boston University School of Personalism. His PhD advisors were Harold DeWolf and Professor Brightman there, who were the leading thinkers of the Boston School of American Personalism, that pretty much thought of the person, the personal consciousness as the center for how one could proceed philosophically and the basis of philosophical thought. Dr. King, under the influence of these professors, found that being was defined as personal consciousness, and that his metaphysical and this was his metaphysical and philosophical grounding for the idea of a personal God, one, and for the dignity and worth of human personality. He wrote of personalism that the clue, quotes, the clue to the meaning of ultimate reality is found within the personality. So ontologically, Dr. King saw that this notion of the dignity and the innate dignity of the person, grounded in a divine, that is something larger than oneself. In his Judeo-Christian modality, it was the notion of God as that grounding, but on top of that grounding stood the dignity and worth of the person, and it is that personal consciousness from which we derive our being and we discover our moorings as a person. Out of that comes a practical engagement. That practical engagement being informed by one's beingness, one's moral and ethical standing, being informed by one's ontological presence and ontological standing. So this notion of personalism that he sort of was able to ground in, find a grounding for what he was trying to think through as a young person. Again, he was 24 years old here. What he was trying to think through as a young person in terms of what this all meant. A very notion that when he was 12 and 14 years of age, he was ready to write white people off. He had seen going to and fro. He lived in a middle-class family in the African-American community. He had seen the injustices not only of black men being decimated, being hanged. This is in Atlanta, Georgia. But the unfairness, just the ripe unfairness that he saw, that he was ready at that ripe age, trying to commit suicide. At that ripe age to write off a segment of society because of what he saw as unfairness. One summer, he took a job against his dad's wishes in a plant. He and his friend took a summer job in a plant, and it is there where he saw that the injustices that were meted along and around the African American community was also meted along poor white communities. These were black men, white black women, and white women working together, but being discriminated against in the same way as a result of a capitalist urge. That sort of adjusted Dr. King's thought with respect to how one sees oneself and one's other person in this overall notion of personal dignity. He found a way to look at that definition as he was in Boston University, and he spent the rest of his life working through an ontological presence of the person as practically engaged in moral and ethical work. Second was the notion of nonviolence. Now, for many of us, we come to think of Dr. King as the epitome of what nonviolence was about after the thought and school of Mohandas Gandhi. But as a young man, Dr. King that was not Dr. King's thought. Dr. King, as he was in school, was at Crozier Theological Seminary. He was a student and in school during the World War II era. So his thought about violence was somewhat different. He thought about violence in a way of a possibility of war and violence being a negative good, something that can deter a lesser evil that can deter a greater evil. And this notion of passive nonviolence in the form of turning the other cheek, he saw as an individual notion, as one person to another being wronged or being righted. This notion of passivity was an interpersonal notion. It wasn't an intersocietal notion. He thought that the only way, there was evil in the world, and he thought that the only way that evil may be mitigated was a possibility of an overwhelming negative force possibly meeting up against an evil force and rooting that out. So it wasn't a nonviolent field that Dr. King had. As a matter of fact, as he left Boston University, that wasn't the end of it. As he came to Montgomery, Alabama, in his first preaching assignment at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, after Dr. King was selected, didn't plan it, didn't know it, didn't want it, selected as the spokesperson for the Montgomery bus boycott by the Montgomery Improvement Association, Dr. King for a while was escorted by 2 guards, by 2 young, typically deacons in his church, that carried weapons to protect him. His notion of nonviolence did not only come from the thought of Mohandas Gandhi, they came from his wife.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was from his wife, not from the notion of necessarily peace, but it was what she knew. The late Coretta Scott King was by far the more cosmopolitan of the 2. It was not even close. She had gone to a private boarding school in Alabama, had traveled the world by the time she was 19, had known about world views, had studied Gandhi, had studied all of these world thinkers in a way that was very different from Dr. King's experience. Dr. King was a son of a Baptist preacher in the Southern mode whose father was a Baptist preacher, whose father's father was a Baptist preacher, and King's destiny was to be a Baptist minister at a local church. It wasn't to be this large, it wasn't seeing the world as largesse. It was seeing the world in the mode of a Baptist preacher at a local church who saw the world in a certain way, but was going to instill that in his membership as a local patron. It was the selection as the Montgomery bus boycott spokesperson that brought that to the fore. So his transformation with respect to nonviolence was ontologically, epistemologically, and intellectually framed in school and in his engagement. The practical engagement of that came out of his relationship with his wife and the practical engagement with the Montgomery bus boycott, where he was able to put some of those practices or some of those intellectual thoughts into practice. There's a restaurant here. The third notion is justice. King notes in his 1958 work, Stride Toward Freedom, that by the time he entered Morehouse College, his concern for racial and economic justice was already substantial, as we had mentioned earlier before. In many of his speeches subsequently and his sermons, he often cited biblical text as an anecdote to his present circumstance of the civil rights struggle. And one such text was found in the Old Testament book of Amos, chapter 5, verse 24. Many of us know it. Let justice or judgment roll down like waters, and righteousness like a never-failing stream. I want to utilize this Hebrew word for justice and judgment, mishpat, in this text to come to terms with how King viewed justice. Mishpat derives from the Hebrew word shafat, which carries the following meaning. One, to defend the cause of, particularly the poor and the oppressed, to deliver from the power of one's enemies, and also to govern, to rule, and to exercise leadership. It infers the divine authority to determine, judge, and execute sentence. Mishpat is differential in that it determines, judges, and sentences that which is love and that which is not love. It's almost like a binary piece, love and not love. Love and not love help to define each other by their binary character. Mishpat then infers the whole determination and consequence of juxtaposed good and evil. Justice then for King can be viewed ontologically as love manifested in concern and care for the divine, by the divine, for the wholesome wellness of being. In practice, justice ruled by love, agape, requires care for the poor and oppressed, struggle against evil in the world, and the exercise of a leadership whose fundamental concern is with the wholeness of the person and the world in which one lives. These three, justice, nonviolence, and personalism, working together, I believe, informed King's ontological and practical placement with respect to his social activism. Personalism, the dignity of the person as the center of philosophical, moral, and ethical reflection and engagement with the self and the world. Nonviolence, the strategic weapon grounded in satyagraha, and agape love, a divine active love that aims to war against principalities of evil and human action while leaving whole the human spirit for wholesome transformation. And justice, the mishpat, the divine concern and care by and for the wholesome wellness of being that leads one to care for the poor and the oppressed, struggle against evil in the world, and exercise a fundamental concern with the wholesomeness of the person and the world in which one lives. These three, I believe, are what informed Dr. King's work, something that we can further explore, something that we can further think through. I think Dr. King himself, in his work in 1954, when he was selected, not self-proclaimed as a spokesperson, led him on a journey where he could exercise these three notions of the person and of the person's being, out of which informs the moral and ethical project of the individual human and of society. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I am profoundly grateful to the organizers of this conference and honored to be invited. As was said earlier, I want to talk about baby Suggs and the Clearing Rock of Ages. In this paper, I utilized novelist Toni Morrison's caricature of baby Suggs, elder former slave woman, herbalist, and holy griot in the novel Beloved, to articulate a womanist motif of earth mother sage and streetwise arbiter symbolizing a theoethic of survival justice. I imagine racial ethnic survival as a communal ecology of justice evolving from the slave plantation era steal-away hush arbors to contemporary street corner churches and informal kitchen table revivals of shared discourse that kept women shored up and sane. I engaged womanist Layli Phillips' communitarian descriptive and substantive work of Melanie Harris's eco-womanist and eco-feminist theories focusing environmental justice to preserve Mother Earth. I analyzed the communal ecology of justice by engaging other womanist thinkers, such as ethicist Emily Town's social critical critique of identity construction in her volume, Cultural Production of Evil, with womanist theologian Stephanie Mitchum's discourse on African American folk healing as cultural reasoning. I also contend that self-reflective resistance is required for empowerment and social emancipation as I engage baby Suggs' spiritual mediations with religious historian Tracy Hook's connections of Yoruba traditions to what she calls life waves, and Rachel Harding's investigation of Afro-Brazil practices in the diaspora context. And finally, using a womanist communitarian theoethical lens, I frame a healing ethic integral to Black women's faith and survival that is not unlike other global women's theoretical praxis and cultural constructs for communal ecology of justice. As Earth Mother Sage and Holy Griot, Baby Suggs is the unchurched preacher who entrusted the cosmos spirits of nature to conspire with the denseness of verdant tree arbors and the foot cushion of tall grass, the sound barrier of directional wind, and the dark cloak of a not yet risen sun, to surround a secret clearing that became sacred space for hearts to breathe and prayer tongues to wail as tears flowed and feet kept a primordial rhythm. The brushstrokes of Morrison's words on the canvas of our consciousness paint a vivid scene. And I quote from Morrison, "When the warm weather came, Baby Suggs, holy, followed by every black woman, black man, and child who could make it through, took her great heart to the clearing, a wide opening place cut deep in the woods nobody knew, for what at the end of the path, known only to deer and whoever cleared the land in the first place. In the heat of every Saturday afternoon, she sat in the clearing while people waited among the trees. After situating herself on a huge flat rock, Baby Suggs bowed her head and prayed silently. The company watched her from the trees. They knew she was ready when she put her stick down. She shouted, 'Let the children come. Let your mothers hear you laugh. Let the men come. Let the wives and children see you dance.' And finally she called the women to her. 'Cry,' she told them, 'for the living and the dead. Just cry.' And without covering their eyes, the women let loose. It started that way. Laughing children, dancing men, crying women, and then it got mixed up. The women stopped crying and danced. Men sat down and cried. Children danced, women laughed, children cried, till exhausted and riven, all and each lay about the clearing, damp and gasping for breath. In the silence that followed, Baby Suggs, holy, offered up to them her great big heart. She did not tell them to clean up their lives or go and sin no more. She did not tell them they were the blessed of the earth, its inheriting meek and its glory-bound pure. She told them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine. That if they could not see it, they could not have it. Here, she said, in this place, in this here place, we flesh. Flesh that weeps, laughs, fresh flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard, end quote. In that hush arbor scene, the then slave mother Baby Suggs symbolized a spiritual force, synergizing a temporary Eden where nothing restricted the human chattel of women, men, and children from spiritual encounters with the divine. She oversaw a human ecology of communal inclusiveness where gender, age, size, or blackness were not barriers. A call to gather within nature's sanctity traveled from ear to ear by hushed whispers to meet in this clearing rock of ages. And such gatherings likely were the closest to what they could imagine as heaven, if only for a few precious moments, to feel empowered and join voices as a living body sustained in communal witness before the slap of reality returned the death pains of a hellhole called slavery. As years turned to decades, turned to centuries, faded memories of freedom were desperately recalled at the clearing rock of ages. As the arc of the moon and the changing sky through clapping leaves finally signaled worship over. I use a womanist communitarian lens derived from a philosophy of communitarianism, but imbued with a womanist ethos that Lily Phillips described essentially as a female liberationist conscious of social justice and anti-oppression, aligned in the everyday street vernacular of lived experiences for common meal benefit or collective well-being. This holistic and pluralistic embrace of transcendent justice is spiritualized in beliefs and interactive practices for positive transformational change. To understand the spiritual force of the hush arbor scene, I find the ecological aims of ecofeminism and eco-womanism offer philosophical centering of Mother Earth as a living system in the cosmology of creation. As Harris elucidates, a distinction between ecofeminist and eco-womanist method is the latter's incorporation of an intersectional race, class, gender analysis linking environmental exploitation to places where global inequalities most directly impact poor people of color, with particular attention to exploitation of Black women as a historically expendable natural resource. Eco-womanism calls attention to environmental and gender exploitation as oppressions while advocating for deliberate environmental justice. I point to the Native American standoff at Standing Rock as a communal ecology of justice exemplified by indigenous peoples' attempts to resist the exploitation of sacred ancestral land. The dusty dirt of bones and spirits are clouds of witnesses defiled by corporate pipelines, raping their memory without regard for the damage to Mother Earth or the rights of Native people to protect the ecosystem. For the purview of this paper, a womanist communitarian lens also reveals deep eco-womanist connections of African and African descent peoples to Mother Earth with spiritual consciousness of her provision, not only for food and water and air and other natural resources, but also for the divine provision of synchristic elements benefiting survival. That is to say that there is a divine plurality in relationship to Mother Earth that was and is not solely a Christian paradigm, since the hush arbor, the clearing rock, are provisions from a living, breathing earth, offering wisdom, healing, and spiritual protection. In today's context, Harris's humanist notion of communing with nature is symbolically interreligious or pagan, yet urges intentional devotional time to be in solidarity with the earth. Hope was and is the essential imagination of racial ethnic survival justice. Hope drives a communal ecology of justice, which womanist ethicist Emily Towns terms the womanist dancing mind, that comes from a particular community of communities yearning for a common fire banked by the billows of justice and hope. I find a womanist dancing mind refuses to accept domination, violation, or defilement of the earth or humanity, despite lived experiences, and concur with Towns' view of freedom as a conscious counter-memory or social critical identity construction that resists and lives beyond marginalization. Thus, Towns refers to Baby Suggs clearing as a site of resistance. Moreover, I find that Baby Suggs symbolized a communal healer and spiritual medium to whom people listened, entrusted their well-being, and to an extent, their lives. Her weekly call to people to dance, cry, to pray activates a trilogy of divine resilience to anything or anyone wrongly exerting domination over God's created. Accordingly, the dispossessed communally invoke survival mechanisms, valuing their personhood to counter the destructive privileging of supremacist presumptions about their inferiority, despite their frequent inability to demand ethical structural changes to protect their environment. I contend that a communal ecology of justice also understands the mutuality of nature's environmental energy as an allied force of protection in the thick growth of trees and grasses that hid slaves fleeing from freedom or yielded source of plant medicinals with learned wisdom passed down through kinship training and oral traditions. As examples, African and indigenous Native American healing traditions evolved to cross-pollinate ecological practices of folk healing in forms of cultural hybridity, described by womanist Stephanie Mitchum as remedies adapted from other cultures based on nature's bounty in particular ecological environments. Mother Earth-derived African roots and customs vary in diasporic contexts, as Rachel Harding noted in Cuban Santeria and Brazilian candomblé, as well as conjuring and hoodoo, adapted as ecological expressions in the United States. The exhaustive research of Yoruba traditions by womanist historian Tracy Hughes reveals an ecological embodiment of spirituality, sustained as a sacred ecosystem or way of living in global nature-centered identities, meaning there is a direct correlation between the condition of the natural world and its ability to provide restorative energy. The diversity of the Black church is rooted in syncretized arts, music, dance, healing rituals, and spiritualized divinations, as well as the non-church lifeways hybridized in global religions while sustaining heightened nationalism. This liberative epistemology should not be confused with the present supremacist notions of American superiority, but a conscious awareness of our African rootedness as a counter-memory to oppressive Eurocentric hegemony. Likewise, communal hush arbor gatherings are reconstructed in present-day kitchen table gatherings, as informal revivals where mostly women and often families nurture what I would argue is still sacred space, away from the societal challenges of compromising multiplicities in daily work roles. Here, as in Baby Suggs Hush Arbor, kitchen table sharing is intergenerational, free-flowing, and sensory satisfying, as a spontaneous act to gather needs no explanation, yet weaves discourse with laughter and dance, the shout, and modest potluck bounty of Mother Earth with prayerful thanksgiving. For people of the earth who witness the deforestation, overbuilding, demolition of childhood memories for new freeways, skyscrapers, and gentrification that blocks out our roots, the resulting wails and tears and angry public protest meetings are counter-memoried by some measure of healing in the sustaining poultice of these communal kitchen gatherings. To close, I am mindful of interreligious approaches to eco-sustainability and propose that a womanist communitarian theoethic of justice is useful to frame a healing ethic integral to sustain eco-justice, as well as recognize that Black women's survival is not unlike other global women's theoethical praxis and cultural constructs. The table, whether hush arbor ground, a cleared floor, or four legs, is an altar open to anyone needing to join in vernacular circles of womanist communitarian care. Sustainability is an integrative healing process that is humanist and environmental, self-reflective and communal, global and interreligious. As such, I propose that we must combine an earth-based ethic of care and creation-centered belief as a liberative epistemology of justice. I propose embodying a communal ecology of justice that welcomes the remembering of religions, cultures, or spiritual praxis with a holistic ethos of self and community. I propose that environmental care be approached as a reciprocal act of resilience with urgency to care for Mother Earth as our sustaining source of life. And finally, I propose communal and self-healing embrace a hush arbor dance of ecological hope more far-reaching than our present reality. Dance with Mother Earth as Baby Suggs urge. Love it and love it hard. Thank you.
Morning.
I have the distinct pleasure of getting to serve on a faculty with Dr. Miles Scribble. My gratitude to the organizers of this awesome event. I am delighted that I have an opportunity to participate in it. I would like to dedicate my presentation to the memory of Michelle Austin, who is a student, was a student at American Baptist Seminary of the West, who appears very briefly in this paper as a woman who showed up in class beginning to wear a scarf because of chemo treatments.
Yes.
Michelle passed away yesterday, fairly suddenly, and so our community is grieving her loss. In this paper, I invite you into my constructive theology classroom to observe the experiences of students coming together across multiple identities and diversities to share their histories in their doing of theology. This is placed in conversation with recent critiques of identity politics and the rhetoric of diversity in light of the present political circumstances in the United States, particularly the role that the rhetoric of diversity had in the most recent presidential election in this country. I conclude with the assertion that cultivating spaces for solidarity of others is an important sustainability practice for communities to work together in the midst of difference. This essay is grounded in the experiences that come from a Christian theology classroom and speaks from a Christian perspective. I believe a convincing case can be made that recent chasms in intra-Christian relationships due to politics, race, class, and other factors means that interreligious principles might best be applied even when only people who claim the identity Christian are present. That argument, however, is beyond the scope of this paper, so for my purposes, we observe a particular classroom in Christian theology in search of sustainability practices through the cultivation of spaces of solidarity. We are gathered in my constructive theology classroom at American Baptist Seminary of the West. We are almost midway through the semester, long enough that we have started to establish a sense of trust with one another, but not quite long enough to have felt like we have risked much together yet. So there's still a good bit of nerves that are visible as we begin this exercise that I have students do every year. We have dragged our chairs into the center of the room so that we can sit together in a circle closer to one another without the encumbrances of tables between us where books tend to be stacked up and computer screens open. Here in the intimacy of this smaller circle, we can see only one another. It is always a room that brims with diversity, a diversity that would sound contrived if I listed out for you all the different categories, quote unquote, of people. A diversity that some institutions would love to claim, or at least they would love it in theory. A diversity that gives me a glimpse of the kingdom of God every time I go to work. I have students from northern India, South Korea, Rwanda, Burma, Michigan, Oregon, and Oakland, students who come from the Church of God in Christ, African Methodist Episcopal, Unitarian Universalist, and nuns. I have N-O-N-E-S. I have students who are cisgender, genderqueer, and transgender, students who have learning disabilities, are blind, are temporarily abled, students who are parents, pastors, priests, and social workers, students who are hyphenated in any number of ways, African American, Native American, Euro-American, Asian American, students who are first generation, second generation, and generation 2.5, students in their 20s, students in their 60s, 70s, and even occasionally in their 80s every now and then, boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, students who are gay, straight, closeted, and outspoken and quiet, feminists, womanists, and lifelong sexists, students who read exceptionally well, and students who struggle mightily, students who are hungry and may well be in graduate school so they can use student loans to pay for heat this winter, students who make a good bit more of money than I do. I am not exaggerating in this description of my typical classroom. These are the people I see every day who are responding to a call that they sense have been placed on their lives to follow God and to lead others in their following of God as well. These are the people I do theology with. In the political discourse of recent months, folks have tended to describe the context in which I live and teach as a bubble, a protected, idealistic fantasy world that is utterly disconnected from the everyday, presumably much more real and practical concerns of the flyover states. The idea is especially curious to me because my students and I still face problems every day. In fact, everyday problems. A student has to meet with her son's teacher and 2 other parents because her son is being bullied at school. I know her son because he comes to class with her and plays in the back of the classroom with a giant bin of Legos that I brought in for him from when my son was his age. He comes up and he holds my hand during break and shows me his latest creations. Another student faces eviction because of the gentrification going on in Oakland. Another student has started wearing a scarf over her head because she is losing her hair to chemo. Another student is made ill with homesickness after hearing his brother back in India was involved in a serious car accident. Another student is shifting in her seat because of chronic back pain. Meanwhile, I'm getting used to my old lady shoes that I've had to start wearing because I've recently been diagnosed with plantar fasciitis and my feet hurt all the time. These are only a few of the everyday problems that we are facing every day. There is no bubble of protection around us. We go one by one around the classroom, reading aloud our spoken word pieces that were created in response to the template provided by Russell Yee in his book, Worship on the Way, Exploring Asian North American Christian Experience. He suggests people fill in blanks for various categories. For example, I'm from a people who celebrate, and then you fill in a holiday, festival, or remembrance. Or I'm someone who comes from, and then you fill in certain cultural customs or practices. I'm from a people who put their hopes in, and then you fill in particular deity or religious belief or practice. And who feared, and then you fill in very bad things that your people fear could happen to you over time. We don't comment on one another's readings, but we do respond, often with tears, with sighs, sometimes with laughter, with murmurs of recognition as we hear some piece of our own stories in someone else's story. And we respond with silence, a holy silence that grows in and around us as the session goes along, as story after story accumulates and starts to shape us into community. Every story is inevitably different. The questions that students respond to root them down into their families' histories with such particularity that they end up revealing to us the ineffable truth in the statement of the psychotherapist Carl Rogers, what is most personal is most universal. Sometimes a student shakes as he reads to us about his people, his family, her history, their parents, longtime preachers who get up in pulpits every week but aren't practiced at this kind of searching public honesty. One year, a student's response was made rhythmic by the repeated refrain, "I don't want to tell you about my family," even as he trudged ahead and told us anyway, laying out his complicated, painful, beautiful history and revealing something of God to us. Like I said, up until this point in the semester, we've started to establish a sense of trust with one another, but we haven't yet risked a lot. But when we read our stories to one another, when we tell about our people, our families, our histories, we move into vulnerable, risky territory. And here we start to learn one another. The end of identity liberalism. In an opinion piece published online in the Sunday Review of the New York Times about 10 days after the 2016 presidential election, Columbia University professor Mark Lillas argues that, quote, "the age of identity liberalism must be brought to an end," end quote. The election results were due to what he calls the rhetoric of diversity, which inevitably excludes, because in calling out or naming specific groups of people, one risks leaving out others. On the campaign trail, Lilla contends that because Hillary Clinton repeatedly named specific groups such as African American, Latino, LGBT, and women, quote, the white working class and those with strong religious convictions felt left out and excluded. One cannot help but notice the rhetorical implication that African American, Latino, LGBT, and women do not hold strong religious convictions. Those are attributed only to the over 80% of white evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump. While Lilla acknowledges some of the good that has come about from what he calls the moral energy surrounding identity, he sees, quote, the fixation on diversity as having mostly a deleterious and even disastrous effect, producing, quote, a generation of liberals and progressives narcissistically unaware of conditions outside their self-defined groups and indifferent to the task of reaching out to Americans in every walk of life. One cannot help but notice the rhetorical implication that African American, Latino, LGBT, and women do not themselves come from every walk of life. Lilla critiques what he calls, quote, the white lash thesis, that Trump's election was the result of an angry white male and white female backlash against the racial progress and therefore a threat to white supremacy symbolized in the two-term presidency of Barack Obama. The term white lash, it should be noted, though Lilla does not, was coined by Van Jones, a commentator on CNN in the early morning hours of the election night, in which he said the election results were, quote, a white lash against a changing country, a white lash against a black president. While the term white lash is new, the concept of white Americans engaging in a vehement backlash against perceived racial progress is not new. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about this in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, in his chapter entitled Racism and the White Backlash. King describes the tragic duality that has, quote, produced this strange indecisiveness and ambivalence in the United States that causes the country to take a step backward simultaneously with every step forward on the question of racial justice, end quote. The step backward, King writes, is the white backlash. And he wrote this text 50 years ago in 1967. And at the time, he points out, the white backlash is nothing new. Lilla contains that the white lash theory only serves to allow liberals a feeling of moral superiority and to ignore what those in the flyover states and Pennsylvania, presumably, were really saying through their votes for Trump. More, he claims, the white lash theory is convenient because it absolves liberals of not recognizing how their own obsession with diversity has encouraged white, rural, religious Americans to think of themselves as a disadvantaged group whose identity is being threatened or ignored. I would say we don't get anywhere by keeping our differences under wraps. I can tell you this from my experience in classrooms full of liberals and conservatives, of Trinitarian Baptists and non-Trinitarian Pentecostals and Unitarian Universalists who come from places all over the globe and gather together for night classes in theology, talking about how we are different, naming our various identities and locations, recounting our histories that are wound up in one another's sometimes painfully and sometimes beautifully. Names identify people, and so does my name, Anselm Kyung-suk Min. So begins an essay in the collection of Journeys at the Margin toward an autobiographical theology in American Asian perspective. Anselm Kyung-suk Min uses autobiography as a method for theological reflection and does so in order to create a deeply complex theology. The imperative in doing good theology, Min contends, is to understand that particularity in needs, perspectives, and experiences is essential. Theological work that is rich enough to sustain communities entails retrieving and reconstructing cultural histories and identities, indeed of reconstructing theology for the sake of its own liberation. But not only for its own liberation, Min advocates for a theology that even in its particularities simultaneously quote, tries to systematically incorporate the needs and perspectives of others into its own theology, making itself in the process less particular and more universal, and regarding itself as an integral part of the emerging global solidarity of others, and as contributing to a concretely universal theology of the future expressive of that solidarity. He talks about the solidarity of others. Others because it preserves particularity while not disintegrating into particularism or tribalism. It resists comprehensive universalism that inevitably erases and silences and marginalizes others that would otherwise disrupt its totalitarian claims. Solidarity because liberation cannot happen in isolation or even consecutively. How many of us have heard, not now, wait your turn. Finally, Min's curious use of the word of in his phrase solidarity of others. He wants to urge us beyond the sense of solidarity with, which still implies a privileged center or normative perspective of reaching out to help others. He says, no, we have to understand that solidarity of others suggests that we must work together and that all liberation is bound up together. My students inevitably come across the image of a mosaic as we gather these stories and begin to reflect on them in light of Anselm Kjosuk Min's concept of solidarity of others. And I like that image of the mosaic as well because it lets the students live with the very real, solid, tangible differences that we encounter constantly in our class. It gives them the permission they need to speak of their own experiences of the world, of God, of history, of hurt, of joy, and to feel that that speaking matters. And it helps my students begin to pattern a meaning in the midst of diversity so that difference doesn't mean that we are doomed to disconnection. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Glad to be here. Goes without saying that I'm honored to be here, that I approached this podium with some fear and trembling, and a lot of gratitude for the organizers of this event. To honor my heritage as a Christian theologian, let me begin with a confession. I once checked the box white in a form. This was some 8 years ago, perhaps, if I remember correctly, and I had recently moved to the United States for graduate studies. I didn't have many options, if I recall correctly. The form read white, black African American, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander. It is possible that I suspected back then that the fact that I was coming from Brazil meant that I should not be checking the white box. But Hispanic sounded to me like a linguistic category, a sound category, that I could not claim for myself, of course, as a native Portuguese speaker. Despite my cultural illiteracy about US American racial categories, in the months that followed, I began to realize that my ethnic location was undergoing an important dislocation. It was no longer, or perhaps not exclusively, my skin color that informed my ethnic and racial location, but my language. Or better still, the language that spoke underneath my voice, that undergirding sound, that unmistakable accent, those characteristic grammatical mistakes, all of that indicated to me that white was the wrong box. I realized that whiteness is not only a visual category that connects a particular color spectrum to a particular racial category. Even as I circulated in the world somewhat safely under the mantle of a white skin, the soundscape of my voice, of my creolized English, colored my ethnic location and belongings in this context. A white skin with a brown voice. Ever since I failed my first exam on ethnic self-identification in the United States, the echoes of an old biblical text have been haunting me. Certainly, you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26. My reflections this morning are about the ways in which the sound of a voice, its tone, its accents, its trepidations, are part of our racial imaginaries. I divide my talk in 3 sections or themes, and those are 1, sound, 2nd, tone, and 3rd, accent. First, sound. It is perhaps undeniable that our social imaginaries about race and ethnicity are predominantly visual. More often than not, when we think about the phenomenology of race, we're thinking about color, pigmentation, shapes, and contours. Race appears before our eyes, and therefore we see race. In a very insightful essay, called The Sound of Race, the Prosody of Effect, Latino philosopher Eduardo Mendieta has proposed that we expand our understandings of race beyond the visual sphere and indeed learn to listen to the sounds of race. Mendieta submits that most philosophical work on race and critical race theory assumes that racism is a retinal malady. Quote, race is the detritus of some chromocracy, and racism is the means by which we construct, maintain, and enforce a chromocratic hierarchy, unquote. Mendieta does not deny how these chromocratic hierarchies shape our social imaginaries and how racism is a profound world view. But Mendieta pushes us to think about race as the enactment of a whole social body. Racism, he argues, dissimulates its insidiousness by foregrounding sight and the visual. But it is relentlessly attuned to every physical clue. How we walk, how we dance, how we smell, how our hair feels, and of course, how we sound. The technologies of the racist self are the technologies of racializing orality and phonology, unquote. Mendieta thus places race along the vast spectrum of the human sensory, embodied, and affective experiences. There's race in what we see, but also in that which we touch, in our tastes, in the food we eat, in what and how we listen to others. Mendieta's and my focus in here today are precisely on this final category of how we listen. What he calls the sonic self is constituted by the way in which we speak, how we speak, to whom we speak, under what conditions we speak, with what tone, with what accent. All of these categories shape our bodily comportment and our racial imaginaries. Mendieta argues that prosody, that is the rhythms, the accents, the cadences of our voice, reveal truly how we all have been branded in the tongue. It reveals the history of a language, and with it, the many histories of social conflict. Borrowing vocabulary from the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, Mendieta further suggests that racism engenders a particular linguistic habitus that dictates what constitutes a proper language or a proper sound. Bourdieu refers to the strategies of to the strategies of condescension, which consist in deriving profit from the objective relation of power between the languages that confront one another in practice, thus creating a hierarchy of languages, of those who speak them, and of those who speak them. The decolonial theorist Walter Mignolo proposes an interesting historical epistemological story of this linguistic hierarchy. Miolo indicates that in the first wave of European colonial expansion, beginning with the Spanish and the Portuguese empires in the 16th century, we can witness to a geopolitical organization of the world system where Europe occupies the center and top position in the global cartography of power. Miolo calls this colonial difference. It's the difference between what is Europe and everybody else, basically. Strictly speaking, this is a spatial organization of the world. During the 18th century, however, Miolo detects a reorientation and a reorganization of the social imaginary within Europe itself that shapes a new difference or a new way of thinking about Europe that divides Europe of the north and the Europe of the south. Northern European countries, especially France, Germany, and England, construct themselves as a special cut in the fabric of European cultural dominance. Those countries from the Iberian Peninsula, precisely because of the presence of non-Europeans, Arabs, in the Iberian Peninsula, namely Portugal and Spain, those countries in the south constituted a particular mode of being European, a different race, if you will. In other words, 16th century Spanish and Portuguese colonialism, according to Miolo, created a colonial difference between Europe and the rest of the world, particularly the Americas. But 18th and 19th century French, German, and British colonialism and imperialism created an internal colonial distinction within Europe. For Miolo, this distinction is crucial to understand the invention of the category of Latin America, which is the American correspondent to the imperial difference established within between northern and southern Europe. As for Miolo, as the United States gained prominence and became a superpower, playing a game in the world in world politics, there was the necessity of creating a distinction within the Americas. This division for Miolo is no longer simply spatial or not even cultural. It is a construction that carries colonial power differentials, constructed in Europe and imposed and superimposed in the Americas. The America that begins to be constructed in the 19th century is one racially and linguistically split between Anglo-America and Latin America. Miolo suggests that the social formation of the category of Latinos and Latinas in the United States is the most recent iteration of this long imperial history. Borrowing from Mendieta's insight, we could listen in this historical trajectory the echoes of linguistic hierarchies. Latin America and Latino and Latinas in the United States are linguistically marginal to the world sound of colonial powers. As Gloria Ansaldúa would claim, the borderland is not just a spatial visual place of demarcation, but also a linguistic, sonic, affective borderland. For Ansaldúa, to inhabit this accented linguistic soundscape that is neither English nor Spanish threatens the aspirations of a single sound, of a sole language. Sonic deviations are indeed threatening. In a New York Times article entitled, "If Black English Isn't a Language, Then Tell Me What It Is," James Baldwin had already indicated that racism in the United States echoes a world sound that denies Black Americans of their language and their creative and disruptive use of English. Baldwin argues, and I quote, "Black English is the creation of is a creation and invention of the Black diaspora, and in the context of the Black church. African Americans created a new language. This was not merely the adoption of a foreign tongue, but an alchemy that transformed ancient elements into a new language. A language that comes into existence by means of brutal necessity, and the rules of the language are dictated by what the language must convey. Black English speakers, in this sense, speak English with the accent of a different world that constantly remembers. That is, bringing together the members, as womanist scholars would insist." Mendieta builds upon Baldwin's insight to suggest that the neglect of Black English was an intrinsic component of American segregation. Musicologist and historian of the American South, Carl Hagstrom Miller, has argued that Jim Crow was not only about the exclusion of black bodies, but also of black sounds. He identifies the creation of a musical color line that ultimately brought the logic of segregation into the realm of sound and style, linking sonic signifiers of race to corporeal bodies and physical landscapes that Jim Crow already had been trying to contain for several decades. Black English, in this sense, is dissonant, is out of tune. And this brings me to the second point, question of tone. I want to suggest for a reflection today that our social imaginaries around race are deeply embedded in this out-of-tuneness. Racialization of people often occurs under the tense social relations that perceive the intonations and the cadences and mark those things as deviations of a standard voice. The racist dream of a unified and purified race is always the dream of a single voice, of a single tone, and the exclusion of all that is out of tone. In an essay titled Of an Apocalyptic Tone, recently adopted in philosophy, the French philosopher Jacques Derrida reflects upon the tone and the very possibility of thinking about the tone. Derrida is interested in an obscure text where Kant, the German philosopher, critiques the overlordly tone adopted by certain kind of philosophers who claim to have access to philosophical knowledge without the proper mediation of the faculty of reason. Kant is particularly concerned that these arrogant, self-righteous philosophers set themselves apart from society precisely because of their special access to some revealed truth. The tone with which they speak philosophical truths set them apart from everybody else. In unmistakable deconstructive fashion, Derrida nevertheless catches a moment of trepidation in Kant's argument. While Kant worries about the overlordly tone, his own critique mimics the tonality of his opponents, trying to dismantle it by replicating it. As Derrida reminds us, Kant set up a tribunal to arbitrate between the conflicts between the provisionally inferior faculties, meaning namely the faculty of philosophy, and the higher faculties, meaning our faculties of theology. Those who then speak with an overlordly tone, for Kant, pervert the voice of reason by mixing the two voices of the other in us, the voice of reason and the voice of that secret oracle who reveals divine messages without the mediation of reason. Derrida notices Kant's anguish over this matter. The voice of the oracle always lends itself to all kinds of interpretations. It's never a single voice. Kant's fear, Derrida affirms, is not so much that his adversaries speak out of tune, but that their philosophical tone perverts the voice and single tone of reason. The problem is that their philosophical voice is multiple. They do philosophy with an accent, by mixing the voice of reason with the voice of that softly whispers of secrets, a tone and an accent that derails reason. For Kant, this confusion of voices is utterly dangerous. And Derrida's move troubles and decenters the Kantian dream of a single voice, of a single tone. In what became one of his first overtures into the apocalyptic imagination, Derrida proposes to parasitize the tone of Kant's philosophy with the poetical overabundance of an apocalyptic tone, of an apocalyptic tonality. And I quote, "Let us imagine," Derrida saying, "that there is an apocalyptic tone, a unity of the apocalyptic tone, and that the apocalyptic tone is not the effect of a generalized derailment of reason, multiplying the voices and making the tone shift, opening each word to the haunting memory of the other in an uncontrollable polytonality with grafts, intrusions, interferences. This generalized derailment of reason is the possibility of the other tone, the possibility of multitonality." What Derrida says of the apocalyptic tone, I believe, is salient to our critique of the racist dream of a single tone, of a dominant accentless language. He says, by its very tone, the mixing of voices, genres, and codes, and the breakdown of destinations, apocalyptic discourse can also dismantle the dominant contract or concordat of a single language. Might we all think of accents, linguistic bricolages, slangs, rhythms, and tones of the human voice as the breakdown of the racist dream of a single language, of a standard grammar and accent? This question brings me to my final point, accent. I have come to think of the accent as this constant presence of a parasitic voice inhabiting the language of dominance. It is the presence of a different world sound that finds its way into a dominant language. By doing so, accent reinvents a language while also questioning, problematizing, and subverting the claim for a pure language. The accented subject speaks the dominant language, but with the rhythms, cadences, and sounds of another language, of a different world sound. The broken English of immigrants, of the poor, of oppressed communities, is broken insofar as it breaks the logic of standardized, racially coded English. I recall the scene that provided the initial impetus for this paper. Peter, the apostle, after having twice denied his discipleship to Jesus of Nazareth, who was being trialed as an enemy of the empire, is approached by bystanders who recognized in his voice that he was in Jesus' group. Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you. How often indeed we are betrayed by our accents. How revealing, how disclosing, how vulnerable, and how unsettling is the human voice. And how quickly indeed the bystanders of empire detect accents that do not conform to the sound world of imperial power. In our collective efforts to theorize race and to mobilize resistance to racism in all its shapes and sounds, we might do well to acknowledge the colorfulness of our many-toned language accents. Mendieta posits, the racist self is a product of technologies of oral and sonic discrimination. The racist dwells in a sound house built by linguistic dispossession and oral policing that builds sonic hierarchies. The racist condescends by pretending their voice has no accent and speak without trace of their class, their religion, their schooling. Wittingly or unwittingly, we dwell in the sound house racism built before we enter its visual sphere. The racist dreams of a pure race at the same time that he dreams of a pure language, a perfect sound, a harmonious white prosody. The anti-racist, in contrast, begins with dreaming in many voices, with many accents, dancing at different rhythms, revealing the opulence of the human voice. I hope that this presentation and the accent of its proposals may increase our anti-racist efforts to dream and to listen to more voices and their accents. Thank you.
We have time for, I'm afraid, for only one or two questions, or comments, or responses. Before we do that, what did I tell you? That was really extraordinarily informative and interesting, and I had at least 20 minutes worth of questions and comments in my own, which I'm going to surrender for the sake of you. In fact, please.
Hey, my question is for you.
Oh.
Do you think there's also a sexist tone in which the voices of women are not received in the same way as the voices of men? I mean, you can see Morgan Freeman playing God, but can you think of the female equivalent?
Absolutely, yes, if I could say that. And your comment reminds me of course, the election and how certain ideas of pitch are deeply gendered, you know, and how female sort of craziness, right, is coded under the language of a pitch, right? So if particular gendered people speak with a higher pitch, they're being sort of bossy and etc. So all the associations around that pitch and yeah. So absolutely, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Good news, we actually have 10 minutes. So, Susan?
I guess, anyway, I was really interested in this because I kept thinking of other examples and how the subject could be expanded.
Oh yeah.
The feminine was one of the things I was thinking of. But the two other things, one was class, because there is such a difference in the way economics drives speech. And the other was regionality. So in the United States, there are tens and tens of regional accents, and some are only within 20, 30 miles of each other. And do you have any comments about how that influences?
Yeah, but there's, even though the multiplicity is there, there's also a clear hierarchy of those, right?
Right.
So what, particularly for those of us in intellectual circles, it's not always welcoming to speak with a southern accent, right? So there's ways of coding language and accent with intellectual capacity, intellectual formation, and all that, and certainly of class. I mean, this is really, to me, obvious. And in studies around the formation of vernacular Black English, there are roots in that history that point to the ways in which the English spoken in African American communities is sort of poor folk kind of English, you know. So there is this class layer associated with soundscapes. Yeah.
Let me ask if there's a question for any of our other panelists. I'm going to go to this side of the room. Please.
Thank you. This is for Jennifer. You were talking about the bubble and about how there's this idea that maybe the coastal elites live kind of above everyday problems, whereas we don't, obviously, as you shared. Do you think perhaps part of the response, I hate to blame, part of the blame is that we don't share those vulnerable moments in social spaces or on social media? That we talk about these high-level ideas without saying, oh, my cat puked on my bed this morning. You know, like just this everyday problem. Do you think we own some of that, and should we change that in the future?
I do think that vulnerability is something that is not valued in a capitalist culture. And so that expressing weakness is something that then puts you lower down in the hierarchy. So I am a proponent for lifting up the value of vulnerability and revealing to one another what our weaknesses are. And I think that that is one of the things that can connect us across lines when we understand that we are all broken, and that's part of why we need one another. Yeah.
Thank you. A question for any of the other panelists? Yeah. Far in the back.
For the first speaker, I just wanted to say, in reflecting on the issues and the times, it really feels like ethics and the intensity of ethics as a question for the society has been supplanted by economics as a question of our time. And I was just feeling those two poles of that earlier time and how significant the ethical questions were, and the diversity question, and that economics has become the main issue of our time rather than life itself. And then bouncing on some of that, the idea of diversity. The diversity itself is what creates life. If we don't have diversity, I mean from the biological, you know, if we have a mono system, we don't have life. So it's the more diversity itself, we forget that it's our diversity and the sounds again, that the diversity is why we have life in the universe or on the planet or anywhere else. And I think that we're missing something there. It's like the urge to a monoculture the urge is like a DACA urge in a really weird way. That, yeah, and the ethics involved in that.
You know, it's interesting. Dr. King, during one of his winter breaks, spent the entire winter reading and studying Karl Marx's Das Kapital to understand what Marx was saying and then to sort of critique that in his own thought. King was not a capitalist, not a socialist or anything else. I mean, he was an American in an American sense, right? I mean, you know, capitalism was a reality and it wasn't a bad thing for him, other than the notion of how the distribution of wealth distorted social well-being, right? He was not, and so with that, I think King's issue was less an economics of, less an idea of structure of the capitalist system as a theoretical and intellectual notion, but how that system operated, right? And so, and that's where, for him, I think, the injustices lay. You know, Mircea Eliade and Charles Long, the two of the four pioneers of history of religions, thought of this notion of mythical time, right? Mythical time being an eternal present, right? It stays with us. And I think one of the things that I took away from thinking about these three notions of King, this notion of personalism, this notion of justice, this notion of nonviolence, was in this area of mythical time where these three notions, as ontological and hierophantic notions, in their way could be grasped throughout space and time for us today to be able to utilize those notions and wrestle with those notions to attack social justice movements, not in the same way that King did, but utilizing these notions in a way where well-being could come in. And I think this idea of economics comes into play in that area where we look at well-being and distribution of our natural resources and the care we take our natural resources to ensure a world that is healthy and a people that are healthy. I think that's a general notion. That's something that I took away from.
Christian, Devin, on the queue, and we'll come back over this side.
I'll pass. There might be a question for Valerie.
Thank you. You have a question for Valerie? Oh, two questions for Valerie. Do you want a question for Valerie? Question, we'll come back to you too. Let's go here.
Yeah, for Valerie, I really wanted to applaud your triumvirate of dance, cry, and pray. And I wondered how you would extend this into sort of the Christian practice of fellowship.
I think that it very much is or should be a part of Christian fellowship. The point I was trying to make is that those practices also are imbued beyond Christendom in even more indigenous understanding. But I really think that our Christian notions of dancing, crying, and praying allows us to open up to one another, to our stories, as Jennifer mentioned, to our vulnerabilities. I also feel like we spend so much time emphasizing the table of Eucharist that we forget the essential essence of the table of fellowship time. And to understand that even that I call it bounty, but as modest as it is, that everyone brings as a potluck, comes from Mother Earth. And if we begin to respect, however humble, what people could bring, or however elaborate people bring, that we're bringing from our sacrifice, from our giving, and to tie that to what we get from Mother Earth as a giving and a sacrifice. It's hard for us to, I shared in a class that I lectured in this week, it's hard for us to, I think it's Wurzba, Norman Wurzba has a wonderful book that says it's hard for us to eat and to really enjoy if we're not cognizant of the sacrifice that went into that provision, from the farm workers to the warehousemen to the, all of the things. And that then intensifies our grace of Thanksgiving.
We have 2 minutes, after which I turn into a pumpkin, and you will not get to lunch.
So I think this question sits between Aaron and Valerie, and it connects the communitarian ethos within the diaspora of a person is a person through persons, Boko Ubuntu, as it lives in this doctrine of personalism. And how do you see through these generations of Christian practice, preaching, and view the thread that deeply connects what was so beautifully embodied in so many of the memorable phrases of Valerie's talk and the brilliant inspiration and world change brought by Dr. Kingsman. In a perfect example.
I think that this embodiment of community, for me, communalism is a sense of fellowship and recognition within, I would say, cohesive groups. I'm moving it beyond communalism to communitarianism, which says that we not only have concern and love for the survival of our group, but for the family and the community of which we're part. So in other words, we're all in this together. I think that that is incumbent in Dr. King's philosophical and pragmatic approaches. He was hoping that he could appeal to the ethic of humankind, to see the better in one another. And he was sorely disappointed when he realized that, as we did in this election, that it's not about the promotion of us as a people together, to work together, but it's still about those silos of difference. So I'm hoping that as we, and I hope I'm answering your question, and I'm going to give it to Aaron. I hope that as we pursue, even here at the GTU, this notion of sustainability, that we try to put it in practice here on our campuses, and to take the time to be more communitarian.
You know, part of King's problem, and this is my family had a lot. But part of King's problem was that he could not get past his own community. In 1960, the National Baptist Convention split because they did not want to, a balance of them, leadership on down, had problems with the notion of active social justice, right? And this notion of active social justice King in his studies, and I thought it was a natural thing after an experience, but it wasn't, even in his own community. We want to go on Sundays, we want to go to church, and we want to worship in freedom and in truth, and not be saddled with what we get hit with 6 days a week. You know? So even in his own community, he found the difficulty in getting the preachers to understand the elemental notion of what Luke chapter 22 is all about. And that's what the difficulty, yes, Professor, that's what the difficulty was, just in one notion. So I'll stop there.
Let us bring those questions that remain to our table fellowship, and please show your appreciation to our panelists.
Thank you, Professor O'Hare, and thank you, panelists, for a fantastic panel. What I neglected to mention when I was talking about sustainability is the 3 pillars of sustainability. And, there's economic, ecological, and social equity. And the 3, as I had mentioned earlier, are integrated. So this panel on social emancipation and justice, very much rooted in the ground where we stand, points us in the right direction in terms of a trajectory towards social integration, inclusion, and collaboration, rather than divisiveness, silos, and alienation. Because if we sit in splendid isolation in our communities, we will never achieve the goals of sustainability. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Where is lunch?
So now housekeeping. Lunch is through this door, okay? And if you decide to leave and come back for another panel, another session later on, then please take your things with you. Otherwise, lunch is available right there.
It's 1 o'clock.
And we start at 1 sharp. And